Page 38. BPD's, sorry about that. BPD's arrest of loiterers for trespassing and failing to obey orders to disperse frequently fall short of these due process standards. BPD often arrests people standing on streets or sidewalks for trespassing when they cannot provide a reason for their presence that officers deem acceptable. Our review found numerous cases in which BPD officers arrested individuals on sidewalks near public housing complexes or private businesses simply because officers determined that the arrestees had no legitimate purpose or no business in the area, precisely the type of vague, subjective trespassing standard invalidated in the Morales case. For example, on April 2010, BPD officers approached 5 African Americans sitting on a brick wall in front of a private business. Officers wrote in their report that they approached the group to ascertain their purpose of sitting on the wall in front of this location. When the individuals responded that they were just chilling, officers arrested them for trespassing because the men could not give a valid purpose for being on the property. Officers provided no warning before arresting the men and did not charge them with any other offense. Later the same month, a different BPD officer approached 2 males sitting on the steps of 110 North Fremont Avenue, a street that borders a public housing complex. When the men attempted to get up and walk away, the officer stopped them and asked them what they were doing on the property. The man responded that they were just talking. The officer then, without any warning, arrested the man for trespassing because neither was able to provide any legitimate explanation for being on the housing authority property. In September 2011, a BPD officer similarly arrested a man loitering directly beside the 2501 East Preston Street Greater Missionary Baptist Church. A church, really? Loitering? The officer made the arrest after asking the man why he was in the area and learning that the man had no business near the area of the church's steps. Each of the arrests violates constitutional due process requirements because the arrested individuals lacked notice that their apparently innocent behavior was unlawful. We have found evidence that BPD supervisors have explicitly condoned trespassing arrests that do not meet constitutional standards, and evidence suggesting that trespassing enforcement is focused on public housing developments. A shift commander for one of BPD's districts emailed a template for describing trespassing arrests to a sergeant and a patrol officer. The template provides a blueprint for arresting an individual standing or near a public housing development who cannot give a valid reason for being there, a facially unconstitutional detention. Equally troubling is the fact that the template contains blanks to be filled in for details of the arrest, including the arrest data and location and the suspect's name and address, but does not include a prompt to fill in the race or gender of the arrestee. Rather, the words black male are automatically included in the description of the arrest. The supervisor's template thus presumes that individuals arrested for trespassing will be African Americans. Real good. Okay, on page 39, what you're looking at is a copy of the template. And on line 3, you see at the end of the sentence, I'll read the whole sentence. And an area known for violent crimes, Officer Doe observed a black male. Okay, and there's no drop down to fix that. You'd have to cross that out and write in whatever else was there. BPD unlawfully detained individuals for investigation, effectively arresting them without probable cause. This is page 40. Our investigation further revealed that BPD officers unlawfully detain persons for extended periods of time, sometimes for at least several hours, without probable cause. These detentions constitute arrests and violate the Fourth Amendment. BPD does not process these detentions as arrests. Instead, officers use them to detain and question people suspected of crimes in hopes of uncovering evidence supporting an arrest, and 2, facilitate custodial interrogations of witnesses or other people with knowledge of suspected crimes. That one happened to me, and I ended up getting arrested. I had to go to court, and by the time the 3 officers that had jacked me up finished their testimony, and the judge, not my attorney, the judge busted them for lying. They dismissed the case on me. Anyway, neither purpose validates the requirement that officers must have probable cause to exceed the constitutional limits on investigative detentions. Detention for custodial interrogation, regardless of its label, intrudes so severely on interests protected by the Fourth Amendment as necessarily to trigger the traditional safeguards against illegal arrest. And there are several cases where the above is cited. While Terry allows officers to detain individuals for brief investigation where officers have reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot, Terry stops may not resemble a traditional arrest. Courts have resisted putting precise limits on the permissible duration of Terry stops, but have found 90-minute detentions unconstitutional. Right. So you know at least 90 minutes that's an hour and a half. You know that's too long. Okay. While BPD does not formally document investigative detentions, we found troubling indications that BPD officers use such detentions as a regular part of investigating people suspected of criminal activity. Local prosecutors described this practice to Justice Department officials as BPD officers making arrests without probable cause on the street, then hours later deciding to unarrest when detention and questioning failed to uncover additional evidence. Our review of BPD documents confirmed that BPD uses these unlawful detentions. For example, in October 2010, an officer responded to a call for suspected burglary that indicated several African American men were using a green truck to carry away a furnace. The officer arrived on the scene and approached 3 African American men who were standing around a green truck with a furnace on the back. In response to the officer's questions, one of the men stated that he was helping the other men move the furnace, which had been found in a nearby alley. The officer detained the men while he conducted a canvass of the area, which did not find any property from which the furnace could have been removed. Despite failing to identify evidence suggesting the men were involved in a burglary, the officer nonetheless placed all 3 men in custody and transported them to the Western District headquarters for further investigation. While the men were held at the station, the officer reviewed a City Watch camera that confirmed their explanation that they moved the furnace from an alley. After detaining the men for an hour and 40 minutes, the officer released them. BPD records contain no indication that the men consented to their detention, much less to being detained for nearly 2 hours. In other cases, BPD officers have likewise stopped individuals based on reasonable suspicion, transported them to precincts for fingerprinting and further investigation, then ultimately released them more than an hour later when the investigation failed to uncover probable cause to make the arrest. So why did they need to fingerprint them? That was just to get them into the system. These custodial detentions violate the Fourth Amendment, which forbids extending Terry stops for the purpose of gathering additional evidence to justify an arrest. BPD's unconstitutional stops, searches, and arrests result from a long-standing practice of overly aggressive street enforcement and with deficient oversight and policy guidance. BPD's pattern of making unconstitutional stops, searches, and arrests arises from its long-standing reliance on zero-tolerance street enforcement, which encourages officers to make large numbers of stops, searches, and arrests for minor, highly discretionary offenses. This approach to street-level enforcement magnifies the importance of providing officers with robust policies and training and overseeing officer activity with comprehensive accountability systems. Yet, BPD failed to collect reliable data, conducted minimal oversight of enforcement activities, and forced officers to rely on policies that provide insufficient guidance or, in several important areas, facially misstate constitutional requirements. Taken together, these deficiencies contribute to widely constitutional violations. Baltimore leadership prioritized zero-tolerance crime suspension tactics for many years. Starting in the late 1990s, Baltimore City and BPD leadership expressly adopted a policing model that embraced the policies of zero tolerance, You may know it as broken windows. Chief Bratton in New York started that crap when he was in New York, took it to LA, and then he brought it back to New York. Okay, anyway, according to city and BPD leaders, past and present, as well as media reports, Baltimore City based its approach in part to tactics, right here, tactics developed by the New York Police Department and brought in consultants from NYPD's program to oversee its implementation in Baltimore. As we heard from BPD officers and leaders, as well as numerous community leaders, the strategy involved BPD officers making widespread use of pedestrian stops and searches in a purported effort to seize guns and narcotics and deter crime. I'm going to let you read the rest of that for yourself. That's on page 42. We're going to jump to page 48. BPD discriminates against African Americans in its enforcement activities. We find reasonable cause to believe that BPD engages in a pattern of practice of discriminatory policing against African Americans. Statistical evidence shows that the department intrudes disproportionately upon the lives of African Americans at every stage of its enforcement activities. BPD officers disproportionately stop African Americans, search them more frequently during these stops, and arrest them at rates that significantly exceed relevant benchmarks for criminal activity. African Americans are likewise subjected more often to false arrests. Indeed, for each misdemeanor street offense that we examine, local prosecutors and booking officials dismissed a higher proportion of African American arrests upon initial review compared to arrests of people from other racial backgrounds. BPD officers also disproportionately use force, including constitutionally excessive force, against African American subjects. Nearly 90% of the excessive force incidents identified by the Justice Department review involve force used against African Americans. Okay, that's page 48. You can read that portion for yourself. I'm jumping to page 49. BPD's enforcement activities disproportionately impact African Americans. And this is basically just reinforcing the above information. I suggest that you pull the report and read that part for yourself. Racial disparities in stops and searches. BPD subject African Americans to a disproportionate number of pedestrian and vehicle stops on Baltimore streets and search African Americans disproportionately during these stops. Okay, let's talk about the stops. BPD disproportionately stops African Americans standing, walking, or driving on Baltimore streets. The department's data on all pedestrian stops from January 2010 to June 2015 shows that African Americans account for 84% of stops, despite comprising only 63% of the city's population. Expressed differently, BPD officers made 520 stops for every 1,000 black residents in Baltimore, but only 180 stops for every 1,000 Caucasian residents. Okay, and then they did a little chart here that's on page 50. The high rate of stopping African Americans persists across the city, even in districts where African Americans make up a small share of the population. Indeed, the proportion of African American stops exceeds the share of African American population in each of BPD's 9 police districts, despite significant variation in the district's racial, socioeconomic, and geographic composition. For example, African Americans account for 83% of the stops in Central District compared to 57% of the population, which contains the city's downtown business area. Over 93% of the stops in the Eastern District compared to 90% of the population, which includes predominantly low-income urban neighborhoods, and 83% of the stops in the Northern District compared to 41% of the population, which includes many affluent suburban neighborhoods. Even in the Southeastern District, with an African American population of only 23%, 2 out of 3 BPD stops involved African American subjects. Okay. And there's the chart, and I know it's hard to see here, so again, I encourage you to actually pull the report down. All right, I'm going to, they put this map in there, and that it just shows during a specific period of time all the arrests that were made, and all the, if you can see it, all the green dots that you see, those are African American arrests. And if you can find any dots, there's one right there. That's a non-African American arrest. Okay. BPD, sorry about that. Here we go. Sorry. BPD likewise stops African American drivers at disproportionate rates. From 2010 to 2015, African Americans make up 82% of the people stopped by BPD officers for traffic violations, compared to only 60% of the city's driving age population. As with pedestrian stops, BPD stopped a higher rate of African American drivers in each of the city's districts, despite large differences in those districts' demographic profiles and traffic patterns. For example, African Americans accounted for 80% of vehicle stops in the Northern District, despite making up only 41% of the district's population, and made up 56% of stops in the Southeast District, compared to only 23% of the population living there. While there are limitations on using population data to benchmark vehicle stops, because the proportion of drivers on roadways does not necessarily match the population living in a particular area, there are strong indications that BPD's high rate of stopping African American drivers is discriminatory. Indeed, the proportion of African American drivers on Baltimore roadways is almost certainly less than their 60% share of the city's driving age population. Baltimore's traffic patterns are influenced by commuters and visitors from surrounding areas with significantly smaller African American populations than the cities. BPD's data confirmed that 25% of the department's traffic stops involve drivers who live outside the city, overwhelmingly in towns and suburbs within the Baltimore metropolitan area. The presence of these individuals on Baltimore roads lowers the proportion of African American drivers, as African Americans account for only 27.6% of the driving age population in the Baltimore metropolitan area. Moreover, basic population data is likely to overstate the portion of African American drivers on Baltimore roadways, because African Americans are less likely than other city residents to have access to vehicles. Nationally, 19% of African Americans live in households that do not have access to automobiles, compared to 4.6% of Caucasians, a disparity that follows directly from sharp racial differences in household income and poverty. This trend is pronounced in Baltimore, where over 100,000 African Americans live in poverty, constituting an outsized share of the city's low-income residents. Consequently, African Americans almost certainly comprise less than 60% of Baltimore drivers, but account for 82% of BPD's traffic stops. Searches. We also found evidence of bias in BPD's searches during pedestrian and vehicle stops, although our analysis is limited by significant shortcomings in BPD's data collection. We first examined spreadsheets provided by BPD that purportedly reflect the department's data on all vehicle and pedestrian stops from 2010 to 2015, including whether officers conducted a search during each stop. Although these spreadsheets typically record the race of the person stopped and the district in which the stop occurred, they do not appear to reflect complete information about searches. BPD's data record that officers conduct searches in only 1.3% of pedestrian stops and only 0.05% of vehicle stops. Rates are implausibly low, period. Interviews with BPD personnel responsible for entering data from officers' stop reports into the spreadsheet confirmed that information on searches is frequently not captured. Other relevant data, such as the reason for the stop, officers' unit assignments, etc., also appear to be recorded inconsistently. In an attempt to address this underreporting and facilitate more comprehensive analysis of searches, experts retained by the Justice Department drew a sample of nearly 14,000 hard copy BPD stop reports, manually coded them, and created a new database containing all of the information recorded on the reports. Within this sample, officers conducted searches in 13% of pedestrian stops and 8.2% of vehicle stops. far higher rates than reflected in the data BPD captured in its